Good morning, everyone. I am very proud to introduce the lecture of Professor Christian Laval at the conference of Scuola Democratica. Christian Laval is a professor of sociology at the University of Paris Ouest, Nanterre, Défense. He has published a large number of important books translated in different languages. I quote only one of the more recent, Dominer, enquête sur la souveraineté de l'État en Occident, avec Pierre Bardot. Moreover, he is actively committed with the association campaigning for social and environmental justice. Christian Laval with Pierre Dardot have the merit, in my opinion, of having kept the flame of critical thought alight, even when the neoliberal hegemony seemed to find no obstacles, following the optimistic period of geopolitical, military, and economical and financial expansion of the 90s. His book, La nuova ragione del mondo, critica della razionalità neoliberista, translated in Italian, is an archaeology of neoliberalism that deconstructs its hegemony, showing how it deploys its project from the economic sphere to every other sphere of human society, attacking also the anthropological dimension. The new man of the neoliberal project is no more a sociological man, but the one-dimensional man naturalized as a homo economicus. This program has been diffused as a present utopia with the dreaming names of knowledge society and knowledge economy, a dream of an expert society with higher levels of growth where work markets are believed to open toward jobs with a higher cultural and creative content. This political and anthropological project required the recruitment and mobilization of schools and universities and their actors around the objectives set by national and supranational political agencies. This dream of an exponential economic development was shattered by a series of profound crises. The stock market crisis downturn of 2001, the Great Recession of 2008, and the nowadays global crisis. I like to remember the words of Professor Colin Crouch at the first conference of Scuola Democratica about the crisis of Western democracies and the linkage with the new forms of dominant financial capitalism. What I'm saying is not new to the audience, and it's part of a critical discourse that have been constructed and diffused by social and political theorists. Today, Christian Laval is giving a lecture that allows us to pass from the phase of criticism to that of the proposal, from the phase of deconstruction to a phase of a reconstruction, from the phase of the defense to a phase of attack. His lecture is about the urgency of a democratic education. It's up to you, Professor Christian Laval.
Thank you, Marco, for this presentation. And first of all, I thank you for the invitation of the meeting, and thank you for the organizers. I'm very happy to share with you the opportunity to present some thoughts and proposals, as you said. You are right to say that to recall the general context in which the colloquium is taking place. We cannot ignore the situation. We are currently experiencing dark times for democracy, not only in totalitarian countries or under authoritarian regimes or governments. Even in the old liberal and representative democracies, civil liberties are under threat. And the pandemic has not improved anything, but on the contrary, as for educators, teachers, these are particularly are dark times too, not only because of their economic and social situation, but also because of the political pressures they face and justified denunciations, sometimes state repression, like as in Brazil, and sometimes because of terrorism, as we have seen in France recently with the murder of a history teacher by a radicalized Islamist. These dark times for call for a strong reaction from all those who believe in democracy, true democracy, in fact, the kind, the kind of democracy that John Dewey uh, taught us to understand as radical democracy. The true reason I quote John Dewey here is that this American philosopher gave us an example of coherent thinking about democracy, which he opposed to what he called errors or faults of liberalism, errors and faults that neoliberalism has taken to the extreme for decades. But above all, as we know, he proposed the most profound and systematic reflection on what a democratic education could be. Criticism of what exists, criticism of neoliberal inspired reforms are necessary but insufficient. Above all, because most of the time they are reactive, only defensive. However, it is necessary to keep the course for the future to maintain, in fact, a logic of transformation. Nothing is more important than making offensive proposals in order not to be subjected to the agenda of the enemies of democracy. Offensive, offensive proposal in which direction? To rethink and refound education on a truly democratic basis. And to achieve this, we must collectively redo, but in a new way, what John Dewey did a little over a century ago when he wrote his masterwork, Democracy and Education, written in 1916. That still remains for me and for us, I think, of paramount importance. We need, in fact, a school revolution. Why talk about revolution? The term revolution is either obsolete or tainted with the worst crimes against humanity, or it has been watered down, trivialized, and recuperated by marketing. Yet I believe it is the right term if we define revolution at the moment of reversal of the historical course and as the moment of refundation of the central institutions of society on new basis. Dewey spoke of reconstruction. In fact, a revolution or reconstructions means a change in the direction of social dynamics and a project to reform institution. It does not only concern the school, in fact, but all the institutions and structures. We know today that this revolution must be democratic, social, feminist, and ecological. The dramatic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have given the first idea of what awaits us if we do not make a radical change in the organization of society. Faced with the threats to the ecosystems of which humans are part, it is not only consumption patterns or work that must change, but collective values, the form of social relations and political institutions. It is in this perspective of this break that we must consider the content of this school revolution. It is high time to ask ourselves how schools and universities are going to train individuals who will be able to control their own destiny and take responsibility for the world in the future. And it is even more than time to design the democratic education we need to give ourselves a desirable future and a habitable earth. The question can therefore be formulated as follows. If we want the future not to be doomed to disaster and to one or other form of tyranny, but to open up to social, ecological, and cosmopolitical democracy, what consequences must we draw from today's situation in terms of education in order to train individuals who will make it happen? We must re-question the aims of education. Today, the essential problem for us is that of the social and political purpose of education. The ultimate reason for neoliberal education, we know that, is to adapt education systems to economic imperatives, and more precisely, to the logic of the market economy. With neoliberal policies, the very idea of public education service has been weakened in favor of an idealization of the corporate model. Education is increasingly seen as a largely private good within the scope of a standardized economic discourse. The pupil and the students are seen as consumers. The objective of economic efficiency prevails over that of human emancipation. In short, schools, like hospitals, like all the public service, are subject to the invasive logic of profitability and competitiveness, to which political leaders of both the right and the left have devoted themselves. This represented a very important shift in the history. Of course, economic goals were never completely absent, but for a long time, the explicit purpose of education was to build the nation state. The purpose was political. The school was expected to form citizens of the state, to form national citizens. At the time, the aim was not to train citizens willing and able to participate directly in deliberation and decision affecting the community, as these were reserved exclusively for elected representatives. The school corresponded, in fact, to the oligarchic form of the so-called representative democracy. But at the beginning of the 20th century, John Dewey, breaking with this limited conception of the power of people, imagined a radical democracy. A century later, it cannot be exactly the same, but the general idea is the same: the universal right to knowledge and the political right to control the rulers, to deliberate, to decide, to act in common, all seen as interdependent, must decide on the form of the school institution. Dewey's great lesson is precisely that the school must be the place for a democratic experience, a place of implementation of collective intelligence in relation to acting in common. This must be the general idea that should guide us. But what democratization? knows the terms democratic school, Scuola Democratica, or democratization of the schools, is often identified both with the quantitative increase in enrollment and with the so-called equality of opportunities between pupils from different social backgrounds. As a matter of fact, we must acknowledge that this conception of democratization as equalization of opportunities as one, it has even become one of the great causes of the progressive left. But we know that this equality of opportunity is largely an illusion for reasons that have long been documented and discussed. In short, the considerable extension of schooling in the 20th century has taught us that it is not enough to provide massive schooling to democratize education, since inequalities in education are always closely correlated with social inequalities. Eventually, the crisis of this great expectation had led to the neoliberal Great Renunciation. There was no point in transmitting useless knowledge that was too abstract and too far removed from professional life. It was necessary to refocus learning on the acquisition of skills that were useful to society in conjunction with companies as far as possible. But equality cannot be only academic. Basically, we must overcome the disappointment about 20th century educational progressivism. Schools alone cannot change society. We must not overestimate the impact of education on society. When John Dewey said that, I quote, social reorganization depends on the reconstruction of education, it should be understood that this reconstruction of education is one of the conditions, not the only one. To change society on the whole, transformation introduced in one single institution is not enough. The school issue is above all a social and political issue. Education always reflects a type of society, and it is futile to opt for a completely democratic school in a society that is completely hostile to equality and democracy. And even more so, if this society is following a course that reinforces inequality and continues to degrade the condition of life on earth, as it is the case today. The core question is how to start already in schools, preparing for democratic life, how to initiate it, how to make it a place where pupils and teachers can experience democratic life. Of course, we must not abandon the dimension of equality in the right of access of knowledge, but we must give ourselves another definition of educational democracy, a broader definition, with a more assertive political content, a more radical definition, to speak as Dewey did. For Dewey, democracy means the characteristic of a society in which the principle of self-government is extended to all political and productive institutions, to all collective activities, whether economic, cultural, and educational. In a word, radical democracy is synonymous with the real power of citizens and producers, which suppose self-reflexivity within all the institutions of society, either political or economic. Therefore, we can understand the central role of education in a society that makes self-government its general principle. It must not only socialize young people, as sociology puts it, it must also give them the desire and the means to participate in the elaboration of collective rules, to engage in discussion, in discussing, and decision-making in common. It is in the school that they can find the resources, the encouragement, the habits, of such common thought and action, which are the characteristic of a true democracy. In a word, the democratic school must help in the formation of democratic mentalities, as Paulo Freire puts it. Furthermore, movements of resistance to neoliberal reforms in the field of schools and universities have been asserting for years that education is a common good, not a commodity. Making education, culture, or health, and many other areas of human and social life a common good refers to a political vision that is directly contrary to the dominant conception of these areas and activities, a dimension that is never better understood than when we speak of human capital. To say that education is a common good is to say that it is inappropriable, that no individual, no group, no state can claim it or make itself the honor. It belongs to everyone in principle. The question precisely is to know what such a requirement implies. What are conditions and concrete implications on school content, on pedagogy, on institutional architecture? This educational common good can only find consistency in an institution with very specific characteristics. For education to be truly a common good, the educational institution must itself be conceived as a democratically governed institution. Then what can be done today to turn education towards social and ecological democracy if schools are not independent of the forms of domination that exist in society? Neither are they a complete reflection or extension of them. There are margins for transforming schools, even in the neoliberal era, that deserve to be explored in an overall alternative strategy. These transformative practices must simultaneously concern the relation between educational institution and the power established in society, as well as the pedagogical relation, the cultural contents, and the organization of internal powers. 5 principles through the practices they inspire can prepare tomorrow's democratic education. I have no time to develop them, but I just say the first one must concern the freedom of thought, whose institutional translation is called academic freedom. The second principle is a search for real equality in access to culture and knowledge. The third principle concerns the implementation of a common culture. The fourth concerns the definition of a democratic pedagogy, a pedagogy of cooperation. The fifth principle deals with the self-government of the school institution itself. Well, to conclude, I say the aim is to make the school a place where teachers and students experience democracy. But to build such a school, we need to go through the experimental method, through a political experimentalism, as recommended by Dewey. It is not a question of projecting a perfect education into an imaginary future in the manner of ancient utopias, but of giving ourselves the chance to extend to a wider scale the aspirations, struggles, and practice that would open up a new form of education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian Laval, for your lecture. We have some minutes more, so I have a crucial question to you. The neoliberal school is an ongoing political social project. It is militant and also among sociologists and educationalists, which work to construct the frame of intelligibility, justification, and legitimation of that project. what I call a structural complicity. Others, on the other hand, regret the old authoritarian system and they dream of a comeback to the old disciplinary school. In this situation, who could be the actors of a democratic education revolution? We have a dream, Christian. How do we translate it into action?
Yes, it's very important, in fact, but complex, and there are several questions in your question. It is true that the neoliberal thought finds support within the education and university system itself. It would be wrong to believe that we are only dealing with some kind of aggression from outside. Many agents of the institution participate actively or passively in the transformation of education systems for different reasons, professional interest and so on, or ideological conviction. But there are also many actors in the institution who are opposed to this and often do not know how to resist a logic that puts individuals in competitions with each other. This is clearly seen in the university, by example, for research funding. I think individual resistance of an ethical nature is indispensable, but it cannot replace the collective organization of resistance that, by example, of the unions, the teachers' organization. I think it's fundamental. But resistance is not enough. That is why it is also important to have a dream, to make democratic counter proposals, to defend the idea that another education is possible. We must make alternative proposal of an offensive nature. That's why we must start implementing now, even if it is only marginally, the alternative principle that I've mentioned. I like very much the expression of the sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who talks about real utopias. But in your question, you ask which actors have, the actors, they've succeeded in mobilize society in recent years. The answer is the students and pupils movements. In the last 2 decades, we have several examples of their role in driving the struggles in France. The only real victory against a neoliberal measure was won by students in 2006. And then we saw the big movements in university and high schools in Italy, the famous Onda in most Italian cities, in Quebec, the Carré Rouge movement against the increase in university fees succeeded in uniting the population to cancel this measure and even led to a change of government. But Chile is probably the best example of the power of the youth movement to challenge neoliberalism. The motto is now well known. Neoliberalism was born in Chile. It will die in Chile. The movement has resulted in a constituent process which is unique in Europe, in the world. The struggles in the field of education play a great role in the change of the course of history. It is, in fact, a role model of society and its fundamental principles that are at stake in these struggles. I think we can dream of an international of teachers and students who will be able to inform and put it in contact all the actors of the struggle. I think which is lacking today, it's a coordination of all these struggles. And it maybe your organization, your review, and others in the world can do it. The second question is even more complex. I'm not a political leader or strategist, but I believe that we are in a situation of bifurcation, as said the historian Emmanuel Wallerstein. He explained that the world is divided and traversed by a systemic confrontation between two great powers, one that brings together authoritarian and neoliberal forces, which he calls the global right, and the other that brings together or could bring together Democrats and social forces, which he calls the global left. We are facing, in fact, with a great bifurcation, as he puts it. How can we make common causes across borders, not only European, but global? I think we have to invent a world politics or a new cosmopolitics. But the tragedy of our time, it would that it would take time to reconstitute such a new cosmopolitics, and that we must act quickly. We do not have time, in fact, to wait because of the urgencies of climate crisis. That's, I call, the tragedy of our time. Thank you.